He ordered a delicate mail-order bride, but a giant Apache woman showed up instead. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. A man named Thomas Wade had lived alone for many years, tucked away on a sprawling ranch deep in the rugged heart of the American West. The wind howled across the plains, and the land stretched out like a canvas of dust and grass. It had been a long time since he'd heard the sound of laughter in his house, or the warmth of a woman's voice calling him to dinner. Thomas was a man of the land, quiet and rugged, but loneliness gnawed at him. His only company were the cattle and the occasional traveler who passed through. But even the travelers had stopped coming. Thomas had heard stories of the wild frontier, of men who had found love, but none of those stories seemed meant for him. One day, desperate for companionship, Thomas decided to take a step that would forever change his life. He heard of a service that connected men like him with women looking to escape their own troubled lives. They promised companionship, a partnership, and a future. He chose a delicate woman, someone who seemed perfect for the life he could offer. After weeks of waiting, the letter came. It was short, sweet, and filled with promises of a fresh start. The picture he received was of a young woman, gentle in nature, with soft eyes and an inviting smile. Thomas imagined her walking into his house, her soft laugh filling the quiet corners, making everything feel like it had purpose again. He prepared the house as best he could, cleaning the rooms, making the firewood ready for winter, and even laying a fresh tablecloth. His heart beat faster with excitement as the day of her arrival drew near. He had no idea that this decision would soon lead him into an entirely new world, one he could never have imagined. On the day she arrived, Thomas stood outside, nervously looking down the dirt road that led to his ranch. The wagon finally appeared on the horizon, moving slowly toward him, its wheels creaking against the rough terrain. As it got closer, Thomas saw the figure sitting inside, a woman. His heart raced. But when the wagon finally stopped in front of him, it wasn't the delicate woman he had imagined. Instead, a giant Apache woman stepped out, towering over him. She was strong, with a presence that could not be ignored. Her clothes were worn but fit her frame perfectly, and her eyes were sharp, full of life and experience. She looked him over without a hint of fear or hesitation. Thomas froze. This was not the woman he had expected. His stomach churned with confusion and disappointment. Where was the gentle lady he had been promised? Instead, standing before him was someone whose strength and power were palpable, a woman whose stature and confidence immediately set her apart from anything he had envisioned. She stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Thomas, stunned, managed to speak, though his voice cracked with uncertainty. Are you? He trailed off, unsure of how to finish the question. She raised an eyebrow and nodded. I am the woman you ordered, she said simply, her voice deep and commanding. Thomas blinked in disbelief, trying to process the reality before him. Was this a mistake? Had he been sent the wrong person? But as he looked into her eyes, something in him told him that this was no ordinary mistake. This was fate. He would soon learn that this woman, far from being the delicate bride he had imagined, was a force of nature that would change the course of his life forever. Thomas stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the woman before him. The wind swept around them, kicking up dust from the dry ground, as if to make the moment even more surreal. She was much taller than he had imagined, with broad shoulders and a stance that spoke of strength. Her hair, dark and wild, fell in waves over her back, and her eyes, sharp and commanding, met his with no hesitation. She was not the delicate woman he had envisioned. In fact, she was nothing like what he had expected. For a brief moment, Thomas considered retreating inside his home, but something kept him rooted to the spot. He had to find out more. Slowly, he took a cautious step forward. You're not who I thought I'd be meeting, he said, his voice uncertain. She looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and steady. I am who you ordered, but I am not the woman you expected. Thomas swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. His mind raced, but his words came out in a jumble. I thought. He trailed off, not knowing how to express the disappointment and confusion that knotted in his chest. The woman did not seem fazed by his reaction. Instead, she glanced around the ranch with a practiced eye, taking in the simplicity of the land. "This is a good place," she said, her voice steady. "But you seem unsettled. Why is that?" Thomas didn't answer right away. He had never been one for sharing his feelings, but in that moment, he felt a strange pull toward her. Something about her strength and presence seemed to demand his attention, whether he liked it or not. "I wasn't expecting someone like you," he said finally, the words coming out more honest than he had intended. She did not flinch. "I am who I am. I come from a place where strength is all that matters. If you were expecting someone soft, you are mistaken." Her words were blunt, but there was no malice in them. Instead, there was an honesty that Thomas could not ignore. For the first time since her arrival, he truly looked at her, really looked at her, and realized that this woman was far from what he had imagined. Yet there was something powerful and undeniable about her. As the sun began to set, casting a golden hue over the ranch, Thomas invited her inside. They sat in silence for a while, neither knowing quite what to say. Finally, the woman broke the silence. "I did not come here to be your servant, Thomas Wade," she said, her voice firm. "I came because I was sent to be your partner. But that does not mean I will follow your every command. I am not that kind of woman." Thomas looked at her, unsure how to respond. She was so different from what he had expected, yet something in her presence made him feel alive in a way he had not experienced before. He had thought he was seeking companionship, but now he wasn't sure what he had truly wanted. "What exactly are you looking for?" he asked. She met his gaze without hesitation. "I am looking for a place where I can be free. A place where I can live on my own terms. And perhaps, along the way, we can help each other. But that will take time." Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Thomas could feel the weight of them, but he didn't know how to respond. He wasn't sure if he could provide what she needed. Yet, in some strange way, he felt the possibility of something new beginning between them. Over the next few days, Thomas learned more about her. Her name was Ahuli, and she had come from a small Apache village far to the west. She had lived through hardships that Thomas could barely imagine, and her strength was the result of years of survival in a world that had been harsh to her people. She spoke little of her past, but when she did, Thomas listened, knowing that there was much more to her than the tough exterior she presented. As they spent more time together, a strange sort of bond began to form. Thomas realized that he had underestimated her, and perhaps, in doing so, he had also underestimated himself. He had always been a man of few words, but with Ahuli, he found himself opening up in ways he never had before. She didn't judge him for his silences or his awkwardness. Instead, she seemed to understand him in a way that no one else ever had. He had no idea what the future held for them, but he knew one thing for certain. Things would never be the same. And perhaps, in the end, that was exactly what he needed. Over the next few days, Thomas found himself adjusting to a life he had never imagined. Ahuli was not the delicate bride he had hoped for, but her presence brought a new energy to the ranch. While he had imagined a quiet, peaceful existence with a soft-spoken wife, he now found himself in the company of a woman whose strength and presence were undeniable. She was nothing like the gentle woman in the letters he had received, but there was something compelling about her. She didn't simply live on the land, she thrived in it. Her movements were purposeful, her confidence contagious, and her eyes held secrets that only time would reveal. Thomas had never known anyone like her. As the days passed, they settled into a strange but growing rhythm. Thomas spent his mornings working the land, while Ahuli, though unfamiliar with the intricacies of ranch life, proved herself more than capable of handling tasks that would have left most people flustered. She had a quiet confidence that surprised him. She carried wood from the shed with ease, helped repair fences, and even took care of the horses as though she had been raised around them. But it was her strength, both physical and mental, that made Thomas pause every time he looked at her. One morning, as they worked together to mend a broken fence near the back of the ranch, Thomas found himself watching her with a sense of awe. Ahuli was pulling a heavy beam into place, her muscles rippling as she worked. She moved with a grace that belied her strength, her hair falling over her shoulders as she concentrated. "You're stronger than you look," Thomas said, unable to hide the admiration in his voice. Ahuli glanced up at him, her dark eyes meeting his with a mixture of amusement and something deeper, something he couldn't quite place. "Strength isn't just about what you see," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "It's about what you carry inside." Her words lingered in the air, and Thomas found himself thinking about them long after the moment had passed. Ahuli wasn't just physically strong. She was strong in a way he hadn't anticipated. And the more he got to know her, the more he realized that her strength wasn't just a physical attribute. It was a way of being, a way of surviving in a world that had often been unkind to her. Later that evening, as they sat by the fire, the crackling of the flames filling the silence between them, Thomas finally worked up the courage to ask her about her past. He had heard bits and pieces, fragments of stories she had shared in passing, but he had never asked for the details. "Tell me about your life," Thomas said, his voice gentle. "What was it like before you came here?" Ahuli didn't speak immediately. Instead, she stared into the fire, the flames reflecting in her eyes. After a long moment, she spoke, her voice low and steady. "I grew up in a village far from here," she began. "My people, the Apache, live close to the mountains, where the land is wild and free. I learned early that survival was about more than just fighting. It was about living with the land, understanding it, respecting it. But the world has a way of changing, and the world changed for us." She paused, her gaze distant, as though she were remembering something painful. Thomas waited, not wanting to rush her, but unsure of how to comfort her. "What happened?" he asked gently. "The world came for us," Ahuli continued, her voice hardening. "The settlers, the soldiers, they all came. They took our land, our way of life. My people fought, but we were outnumbered. And in the end, we were forced to leave, to run." She looked at Thomas, her eyes dark with memories. "I was one of the lucky ones. I survived, but many didn't." Her words hung heavy in the air, and for the first time, Thomas understood the weight she carried. She wasn't just a woman of strength. She was a survivor, shaped by a past that had been defined by loss and displacement. Thomas felt a pang of guilt, realizing how little he had truly understood about her. He had been so focused on his own loneliness, on his own need for companionship, that he had never considered the struggles she might have faced. He reached out and placed a hand on hers, a silent gesture of comfort. Ahuli looked at him, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled between them, and the silence seemed to stretch out, filled with the weight of her words. Finally, Ahuli broke the silence. "I didn't come here to find a home," she said softly. "I came here to survive, to find peace, even if it's just for a little while. I don't know if I'll ever find what I'm looking for, but I know that I'm here now." Thomas nodded, understanding more than he had before. She hadn't come for the same reasons he had. She hadn't come looking for a family or a life of comfort. She had come for something much deeper, something he couldn't yet fully comprehend. But he was beginning to understand. And as they sat in the quiet of the evening, the fire flickering between them, Thomas realized that this strange partnership, this unexpected bond, might just be the beginning of something he never could have imagined. As the days turned into weeks, Thomas found himself growing accustomed to Ahuli's presence in a way he hadn't expected. The initial shock of her appearance and strength began to fade, replaced by an understanding that they were no longer two strangers merely coexisting in the same space. There was something about Ahuli that seemed to draw him in, a quiet force that he could neither ignore nor resist. She had become a part of his world in ways that were both subtle and profound. But not everything was as peaceful as it appeared. A storm was coming, and Thomas could feel it in his bones long before the first clouds gathered on the horizon. It began with the arrival of riders. Early one morning, Thomas heard the unmistakable sound of hooves pounding the earth, growing louder as they approached his ranch. He stood up from his breakfast table and looked out the window, his heart sinking when he saw them. A small group of men riding hard, their faces set in grim determination. Ahuli, who had been sitting beside him, also stood, her eyes narrowing as she recognized the figures. "It's them," she said quietly, her voice betraying no emotion, but her body was tense, ready. "Who are they?" Thomas asked, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Men from my past," Ahuli replied, her tone darkening. "They don't come with good intentions. Thomas felt a chill run through him. The riders weren't here for a friendly visit. Ahuli's expression had changed, her eyes hardening as she moved toward the door. She didn't wait for Thomas to speak as she walked out to meet them. Thomas stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. He wanted to stay back, to let her handle things as she always did, but a part of him knew that he couldn't let her face whatever was coming alone. He followed her outside, the cool morning air biting at his skin as he caught up to her. The riders halted just a few yards from them, their horses pawing at the dirt, their faces hidden beneath the shadows of their hats. The man in front, who Thomas recognized as a former soldier, dismounted and walked toward Ahuli, his eyes narrowing as he looked at her. "You're still alive, Apache," he said, his voice low and rough. "You should have stayed with your people. Now, you've made things difficult for us." Ahuli stood tall, unflinching, but Thomas could see the tension in her jaw, the way her fists were clenched at her sides. "I don't owe you anything," she replied evenly, her voice cold. "I'm here for peace, not war." The man smirked, but there was no humor in it. "Peace? You're in a land that doesn't want you. You think you can hide here, in the middle of nowhere, and forget everything? It's not that simple." Thomas could feel the weight of the words, but he stood beside Ahuli, not knowing what to do, not knowing what could be said to make the situation better. The man's gaze shifted to Thomas, his eyes sizing him up. "So, this is the man who thought he could tame a wild Apache," he sneered. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. Do you, rancher?" Thomas felt a fire rising in him, a protective instinct that he hadn't known he had. He wasn't about to let this man mock them, or make light of the life that he and Ahuli had begun to build together. "I'm dealing with a woman who's stronger than you'll ever understand," Thomas said, his voice steady and loud. The rider's smirk faltered, and he looked at Thomas with a mixture of surprise and disbelief. Ahuli stepped forward, her stance firm. "Leave now," she said, her voice commanding. "You have no power here. This land is mine, and I've already made my choice." The man's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Thomas thought he saw the flicker of something dangerous in them. But then, with a grunt, he turned and motioned for his men to follow. "This isn't over," the man said, his voice low. "We'll be back." As they rode off into the distance, Thomas let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Ahuli stood still, her back straight, her eyes watching the riders disappear into the horizon. She didn't move for several moments, and Thomas could tell she was processing something. Finally, she turned to him, her expression softening. "Thank you," she said quietly. Thomas nodded, though he wasn't sure what to say. He hadn't done anything extraordinary. He had just stood beside her. But it felt like something had shifted between them, something deeper. "You didn't have to do that," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can handle them on my own." Thomas looked at her, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'm not letting you face this alone. Not now, not ever." There was a long silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was as though the words they hadn't spoken were now settled between them, understood without needing to be said out loud. Ahuli's eyes softened, and for the first time since she had arrived, Thomas saw a hint of vulnerability in her gaze. It was fleeting, but it was there. And in that moment, he realized that this partnership, this strange, unexpected bond, was not just about survival. It was about something more. Something that neither of them had expected, but both needed. As they stood together on the ranch, the wind carrying the scent of the land around them, Thomas knew that their journey was just beginning. Whatever came next, they would face it together. As the days passed after the confrontation with the riders, life at the ranch settled into an uneasy calm. The tension between Thomas and Ahuli had started to give way to something different, something more profound than either had expected. They were no longer two strangers merely coexisting in the same space. There was an unspoken bond between them, a silent understanding. Ahuli's strength, both in body and spirit, had begun to ground Thomas in ways he never anticipated. It wasn't just the physical labor she put in, or the way she carried herself, proud, unyielding, but the quiet strength of her spirit that made her someone Thomas could rely on. The bond they shared was not just about surviving together. It was about truly living, about facing the unpredictable world that surrounded them, together. Yet, even as things seemed to calm down, the shadows of the past were never far behind. Thomas knew that the riders would return. They always did. The land was full of people like them, men who didn't understand or care about what it meant to live peacefully on the land. People who thought their way was the only way. And Thomas wasn't sure how much longer he could protect Ahuli from those who wanted to force her back into a world that had tried to destroy her. One morning, as the sun rose over the distant mountains, casting long shadows over the land, Thomas heard something that made his heart race. The sound of hoofs. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, and then, before he could even react, the riders appeared. This time, there were more of them. At least a dozen, all riding hard, their faces grim. Ahuli had been working in the barn, but she was already alert. She had felt it too. She moved swiftly, and Thomas knew she was ready. But this time, he wasn't just going to stand aside and let her handle it. He had made a vow to her that he wouldn't let her face these challenges alone. Thomas grabbed his rifle, moving quickly to join her. "Stay back," Ahuli said when she saw him, her voice firm. She had always been the one to face these dangers head-on. But now, as they both stood in the barn doorway, facing the oncoming riders, Thomas felt a new sense of resolve. "No, Ahuli. Not this time. Not again." She met his eyes, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something. Understanding, perhaps, but also a slight hesitation. "You don't know them," she said quietly. "They're not the same as the last group." Thomas knew she was right, but he wasn't going to back down. Not now, not when it mattered the most. He would protect her, and he would protect the ranch. As the riders approached, their horses kicking up dirt and dust, Ahuli stood beside Thomas, her stance steady, unwavering. She had no fear. The leader of the group, a tall, wiry man with a weathered face, stopped his horse a few feet away from them. "Apache," he spat, his voice thick with disdain. "We've come for what's ours." Ahuli didn't flinch. "This land is mine," she replied, her voice calm but filled with an undeniable strength. "You have no right to it." The man sneered, but his eyes flickered to Thomas, who stood firm beside Ahuli. "So, the rancher has joined the Apache cause, has he?" The tone of the man's voice was mocking, but Thomas didn't flinch. "I'm not on anyone's side except the side of what's right," Thomas said, his voice unwavering. "And what's right is that you leave now." The man laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed in the still air. "You think you can stop us?" He motioned to his men, who were now forming a line behind him. "This is bigger than you, bigger than her." Thomas felt the weight of those words, but he also felt something else, a fire burning inside him, one he had never felt before. He was no longer just a man trying to survive. He was a man fighting for what mattered most. "I'll stop you," he said, his voice low and fierce. "If it means protecting my land and my family, I'll stop you." There was a long silence as the tension between them thickened, the air heavy with unspoken threats. Then, without warning, the man on the horse raised his hand, signaling for his men to advance. Thomas stepped forward, rifle in hand, and for the first time, Ahuli didn't try to stop him. She stood beside him, just as ready to fight as he was. And together, they faced the riders, knowing that whatever happened next, they would face it as one. The man's voice broke the silence again. "You'll regret this," he snarled. "We'll be back." But Thomas wasn't afraid. He knew that if they returned, they would be ready. As the riders turned and galloped away, Thomas turned to Ahuli, his heart still pounding in his chest. She looked at him, and for the first time, a smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "You're more like me than you think," she said quietly. Thomas nodded, feeling something deep and powerful settle within him. He wasn't just protecting her. He was standing beside her, fighting for the same thing she had been fighting for all along: freedom, peace, and a chance at something better. And for the first time since she had arrived, Thomas felt that, perhaps, this strange partnership between them might not just be a necessity. It might just be the beginning of something more than either of them could have imagined. As the days stretched on, the ranch became more than just a place to survive. It was a sanctuary, a place where Thomas and Ahuli built something together. They didn't just repair fences and gather firewood. They were building trust, forming an unspoken bond that neither of them had expected. But despite their newfound strength, the world outside continued to threaten their peace. Thomas had never fully understood the weight of Ahuli's past, but every day, she showed him more of it, and each revelation brought them closer. He had learned that her fight for survival wasn't just about the land. It was about preserving her people's way of life, their culture, their very existence. She carried the burden of that history with her, and he could see it in the way she moved, the way she spoke, even in the quiet moments when she thought he wasn't looking. One evening, as they sat around the fire, Ahuli began to share more of her past. She spoke of her childhood, of the peaceful days spent in her village, and how everything had changed when the settlers arrived. It wasn't always like this, she said, her voice softer than usual. There was a time when my people lived in harmony with the land, when we didn't have to fight for every inch of it. Her words were heavy with nostalgia and pain. But that all changed when they came. They didn't care about the land. They just wanted to take it. Thomas listened intently, his heart aching for her. He had known bits and pieces of her story, but hearing it from her own lips made it more real, more personal. How did you survive? He asked quietly, unsure of what else to say. Ahuli met his gaze, her eyes fierce but filled with sorrow. Survival wasn't a choice. It was a necessity. My people fought, but we were outnumbered, outgunned. In the end, those of us who survived had to run. Thomas could see the pain in her eyes, and he wished he could take it away. But he knew that some wounds went too deep to heal. I'm sorry, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Ahuli gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile. You don't need to apologize. You didn't cause this. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the crackling of the fire. Thomas found himself thinking about his own life, about the things he had taken for granted. He had never had to fight for his land, his home. But Ahuli had, and she was still fighting. Not with weapons, but with something far more powerful, her resilience. The next morning, as the sun rose over the hills, they heard the unmistakable sound of hooves again. This time, the riders came faster, and they were more than just a handful. Thomas's heart sank as he saw them approaching. At least 20 men, riding hard, their faces grim. Ahuli didn't hesitate. She was already at the door, rifle in hand, ready to defend the land they had fought so hard to protect. But this time, Thomas wasn't going to stand back. He grabbed his own rifle and joined her outside. We don't have to do this alone, he said, his voice steady. Ahuli looked at him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then, without a word, she nodded. The riders halted in front of them, their horses kicking up dirt and dust as they stopped. The leader, a man with a scar running down his cheek, dismounted and approached them slowly, his eyes hard. You're still here, he sneered. You should have left when you had the chance. Now, you'll pay the price. Thomas stood tall, rifle at his side, his resolve hardening. We're not going anywhere, he said. You're not taking this land. The man's lips curled into a smirk. You think you can stop us? You're just a rancher. A man who's playing at something he doesn't understand. Ahuli stepped forward, her stance unwavering. I understand more than you think, she said, her voice cold and filled with authority. This land is ours, and we will fight to keep it. For a moment, there was silence. The tension in the air was thick, and Thomas could see the uncertainty flicker in the rider's eyes. But the leader wasn't intimidated. He raised his hand, signaling for his men to advance. Thomas and Ahuli didn't flinch. They stood their ground, prepared for whatever came next. The leader took one step forward, but before he could say anything more, a loud shout echoed from the distance. Hold your fire. The riders froze, and Thomas and Ahuli turned to see a group of men riding in from the opposite direction. At the front of the group was someone Thomas recognized, Boone Carter, the family lawyer who had helped him with some legal matters in the past. Boone dismounted and walked toward them, his expression serious. These men are under my protection, Boone said, his voice firm. And if you want to cause trouble, you'll have to deal with me. The leader of the riders glared at Boone, but the cold steel in his voice made him hesitate. You don't know who you're dealing with, the man growled. Boone's eyes never wavered. I don't need to. I know enough to know that you're not welcome here. After a long, tense silence, the riders turned and left, their pride hurt but their will broken. Thomas and Ahuli stood side by side, watching them go. For the first time in a long while, Thomas felt a sense of victory. Not just because they had defended the ranch, but because they had done it together. Ahuli turned to him, her eyes meeting his with something more than just gratitude. There was a quiet understanding between them, a bond that had been forged in the fire of their struggles. Thank you, she said softly. Thomas nodded, his heart swelling with a feeling he couldn't quite put into words. We're in this together, he said simply, and for the first time, he truly meant it. Days passed after the riders left, and Thomas and Ahuli found themselves in a quiet that was almost too peaceful. The winds had calmed, the ranch had settled, and even the animals seemed to sense the shift. It was a fragile peace, one that Thomas knew would not last. Ahuli had always known that, and so had he. But for now, they both tried to enjoy the calm before the inevitable storm. One evening, as they worked together in the barn, Thomas could feel the tension in the air between them. It wasn't the kind of tension that came from conflict. It was something deeper, something that neither of them had been willing to face before. Ahuli had always been strong, unyielding, but there were moments when Thomas saw the cracks beneath the surface. She had shared her past with him, but there was always more that she kept hidden, locked away in the recesses of her mind. And Thomas, for all his willingness to protect her, knew that there were things he could never truly understand. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the barn, Thomas decided it was time to talk. They had been avoiding it for long enough. Ahuli, he said, his voice tentative but steady. We've been through a lot, but I feel like there's still something you're holding back. Something that's weighing on you. Ahuli paused, her hands stilling in the middle of the task she was working on. She didn't turn to face him right away, but Thomas could see the way her shoulders tensed. She had known this conversation was coming. I'm not hiding anything from you, she said, her voice quiet but firm. I just don't talk about it. I can't. Thomas stepped closer, the weight of his words heavy in the air between them. You don't have to say everything, but I need to understand. I can't protect you if I don't know what's really at stake. There was a long silence, and for a moment, Thomas thought she might not say anything at all. But then, finally, Ahuli spoke. There are things in my past, things that can't be undone, she said, her voice so soft that Thomas had to lean in to hear her. I've seen things. I've done things. And some of them, they haunt me. The confession hit Thomas like a wave. He had known she carried burdens, but hearing the weight of it in her voice made him feel it in his chest. What happened? He asked gently, his tone full of concern. Ahuli turned to face him then, her eyes meeting his with a depth of emotion he hadn't seen before. I was a warrior. I fought for my people, for my family. But there were times when the fight became something else. When survival meant doing things I never wanted to do. And the people I had to hurt, the things I had to leave behind, they stay with me. Her voice faltered for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. I've spent so long trying to outrun my past, trying to forget what I've lost. But it never leaves. It follows me everywhere. Thomas stood still, taking in her words. He could feel the weight of her pain, but he also knew that there was nothing he could say to make it go away. Instead, he did the only thing he could think of. He stepped closer and placed a hand on her shoulder. You don't have to carry it alone, he said, his voice steady. I don't understand everything, but I'm here. And I'll be here, no matter what. Ahuli looked at him, her eyes searching his face as though looking for something. Reassurance, perhaps, or a promise. And in that moment, Thomas realized that they weren't just fighting to survive anymore. They were fighting for something more. Something that neither of them had fully understood until now. Ahuli nodded, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corner of her lips. Thank you, she whispered. I don't know what I would do without you. Thomas felt a warmth spread through him at her words. He didn't have all the answers, and he certainly didn't have the power to heal her wounds. But he had something else. He had the willingness to stand by her, to face whatever came next, together. The next morning, as they made their way to the fields, Thomas noticed a shift in Ahuli. She seemed lighter somehow, as if the weight she had carried for so long was starting to lift, even if just a little. And though he knew the road ahead would not be easy, Thomas felt a quiet hope bloom within him. They were still standing together, still facing the world side by side. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. As the days passed, the tension between Thomas and Ahuli began to shift into something stronger. They no longer just coexisted on the ranch. They had become a team. Their unspoken understanding had deepened, and with every passing challenge, their bond grew. Yet, the peace they had fought so hard to protect was fragile, as they both knew. There were always whispers of danger on the horizon, and neither of them was naive enough to believe that the world would simply leave them alone. But for now, they had each other, and that was more than either had hoped for. One morning, as they worked together in the fields, Ahuli noticed something unusual in the distance. Her eyes, ever sharp, caught the movement of riders approaching far off along the horizon. Thomas, who had been focused on the work at hand, looked up and followed her gaze. The sight of the riders made his heart skip a beat. They were moving fast, and there was no mistaking their intent. They weren't just passing through. They were coming for something. Ahuli's body tensed, the quiet strength she always carried now palpable in the way she stood. Thomas felt a pang of worry but didn't let it show. He knew that the peace they had worked for was never going to last, and this was just the price of that peace. "They're coming for us," Ahuli said quietly, her voice filled with both resolve and something darker, something Thomas hadn't heard before. "We knew it wouldn't last," he replied, his voice steady despite the adrenaline that began to surge through him. "We'll face them together." Without another word, they both moved quickly to the barn, gathering what they could. Thomas grabbed his rifle, checking it quickly, while Ahuli prepared herself with the same calm focus she always had. As the riders drew closer, their forms becoming clearer in the dusty morning light, Thomas felt a rush of determination. These men weren't the same as the ones they had faced before. They were organized, armed, and clearly not here for a friendly visit. The leader of the group, a man Thomas had never seen before, rode at the front, his face hard as stone. There were at least 10 men behind him, all armed, all focused. They stopped just at the edge of the ranch, their horses kicking up dust as they reined in. The leader dismounted slowly, his eyes scanning the area. "Apache," he called, his voice filled with contempt, though there was a trace of fear beneath the surface. "You're a long way from your people." Ahuli didn't flinch. She stood tall, her eyes locking with his, unyielding. "I'm not one of them," she replied evenly, though her tone carried a weight that made the air between them crackle. The man sneered, his hand resting on the hilt of his pistol. "Doesn't matter," he spat. "You've taken what's ours. This land is ours now, and you don't belong here." Thomas stepped forward, positioning himself beside Ahuli, ready for whatever came next. "This land belongs to no one but us," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. The man's eyes shifted to Thomas, sizing him up. "And you're just a rancher, trying to play at something you don't understand. You don't belong here either. You think you can stand in the way of what's coming." Thomas met his gaze without hesitation. "I'm not standing in the way. I'm standing for what's right." The man's lip curled into a snarl, and he motioned for his men to move forward. "Then you'll regret it," he said, drawing his gun. Ahuli didn't move, but her hand went to her own rifle, her stance unwavering. The men behind the leader moved to dismount, but before they could make a move, a voice rang out from behind them. "Hold it right there." The leader and his men froze, turning quickly to see a group of riders emerging from the trees. It was Boone Carter, the family lawyer who had stood by them once before, and this time, he wasn't alone. He had brought a small group of men with him, armed and ready. "You have no claim here," Boone said, his voice as firm as the steel in his eyes. "These people have done nothing wrong, and if you try anything, you'll have to answer to me." The leader of the riders glared at Boone, his eyes narrowing, but for the first time, there was a flicker of doubt in his expression. "You're making a mistake," the man growled. "This is bigger than you, Carter." Boone didn't flinch. "I don't care how big it is. I've seen bigger men than you fall, and I've seen cowards run. If you're here for trouble, you'll find it." There was a tense silence as the two groups sized each other up. The leader, realizing the odds were no longer in his favor, motioned for his men to remount. "This isn't over," he said, his voice filled with anger and frustration. "We'll be back, and next time, there will be no one to stop us." With that, they turned and rode off, disappearing into the distance. As the dust settled, Thomas let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. He looked at Ahuli, her face unreadable but her posture relaxed. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of relief, but he knew it wouldn't last. They had won today, but the battle was far from over. Boone walked over to them, his face serious but with a slight smile. "You two handled that well," he said. "But this isn't over. You need to be ready." Ahuli nodded, her gaze far off. "We'll be ready," she said quietly. Thomas stood beside her, knowing that no matter what came next, they would face it together. And that was more than he had ever hoped for. The days that followed the confrontation were filled with a quiet, determined kind of peace. Thomas and Ahuli knew that their battle was far from over, but for now, they had won. The threat from the riders had been pushed back, but there was no doubt that they would return. However, the calm between them, the unspoken bond they had built, was stronger than it had ever been. They worked side by side on the ranch, knowing that every fence repaired, every crop planted, was another step toward the life they were fighting for. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Thomas and Ahuli sat together on the porch of the small cabin. It had been a long day, but they didn't speak of the work. There was no need. It was in the silence between them that they found a quiet understanding. Ahuli, who had always been a woman of few words, was the first to break the silence. "Do you ever wonder if it will ever be enough?" she asked, her voice soft but carrying a weight that only those who had lived through hardship could understand. Thomas turned to her, surprised by the question. He had never really thought about it like that. He had been focused on the present, on the here and now, keeping the ranch safe, surviving the next day. But Ahuli's words made him think about the bigger picture. "I used to," he said slowly. "I used to wonder if I'd ever get enough peace. Enough land. Enough safety." He paused, looking out over the land they had fought so hard to protect. "But now, I don't think it's about having enough. It's about what you're willing to fight for. And I'm willing to fight for this. For us." Ahuli met his gaze, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to read him. For the first time in a long while, Thomas felt as though he was being understood, not just as a rancher or a man trying to survive, but as someone who had found a purpose greater than himself. "You're right," she said softly, her voice steady. "It's not about how much we have. It's about what we do with what we've got." There was a long silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a quiet understanding that spoke louder than words ever could. And in that silence, Thomas realized something. He had never expected to find peace on a ranch in the middle of nowhere. He had never expected to find someone who understood him, who shared his vision, his dreams. But Ahuli had come into his life like a force of nature, challenging him, pushing him, and in the process, helping him become the man he never knew he could be. Together, they had faced the harshness of the world. Together, they had stood against the forces that sought to tear them apart. And together, they would face whatever came next. As the stars began to twinkle overhead, Thomas and Ahuli sat side by side, no longer just survivors, but partners in a life they had built together. There were still challenges ahead. The world was a dangerous place, and peace was something that had to be fought for every single day. But as they sat there, in the quiet of the evening, Thomas realized that he wasn't afraid anymore. Because as long as they had each other, as long as they had their land and their love, nothing could tear them apart. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. They would face it together, side by side, with the strength and courage they had found in each other. And in that, Thomas found the peace he had been searching for all along. In this gripping tale of survival and partnership, two unlikely allies come together to protect their land and forge a bond stronger than they ever expected. Set in the harsh and unforgiving world of the American West, the story unfolds as a rancher and a powerful Apache woman face both external threats and their own internal struggles. As the stakes rise and danger approaches, they realize that their only hope lies in standing together against the forces that threaten to tear them apart. With the fierce determination of a warrior and the unyielding spirit of the land, they embark on a journey that challenges their beliefs, their pasts, and their future. This is a story of resilience, strength, and the unexpected ties that bind us. As they fight for what they love, they discover that peace is not something that can be taken for granted, but something that must be earned through every battle they face. With rich themes of survival, courage, and redemption, this Western story brings to life the hardships and triumphs of those who dared to live on the edge of civilization. The landscape, the tension, and the deepening connection between the characters make this a perfect addition to the collection of Western stories that explore the human spirit in its most raw and real form. With each challenge they overcome, the rancher and the Apache woman come to realize that their bond is the true heart of the story, and together, they face the trials of the wild frontier, determined to protect everything they have fought for. The final battle may be over, but the journey of survival and the pursuit of peace continue in this unforgettable tale of Western stories.